Okay, so today I want to talk about modularity in structural and functional brain networks and review some basic concepts and guidelines. So when we typically analyze brain networks, we oftentimes think of two distinct scales. On one hand, we consider measures of the brain that are node or edge-centric, for instance, the number of connections a node makes or its centrality. On the opposite extreme are whole brain global measures, like its path length or its efficiency. These two scales comprise a local and global scale, two extremes. But situated between those two extremes is a rich mesoscale. And in this mesoscale, rather than focusing on local properties of nodes or edges, or properties of the network as a whole, we focus on subnetworks, small groups of nodes forming groups, which we call modules or communities. And the set of all communities, the complete partition of a brain into communities, is referred to as a partition. Now, why do we study the mesoscale? Why do we care about the brain's mesoscale structure? Well, there's a lot of reasons. On one hand, it's a way of effectively performing dimension reduction. Rather than focusing on all of the nodes and all of the edges in a network, we can focus on interactions just among the modules themselves. We can also use mesoscale analysis to identify functionally related groups of nodes. Based on the subnetworks, based on the mesoscale structure, we can also classify influential or hub regions according to how their connections are situated and configured with respect to the modules and communities. We can analyze the mesoscale structure of different imaging modalities, from functional connectivity to structural connectivity to even structural covariance matrices. And of course, individual variation in mesoscale structure has been time and time again associated with individual differences in disease and cognitive state, and it also changes across time. So there's a lot of reasons we want to focus on the brain's mesoscale structure. But this presents a bit of a challenge, right? To do any of that analysis presumes that we already know a network's mesoscale structure. But in general, that's not true. For instance, if we were to look at this network, this is an adjacency matrix, it's not obvious whether it has clusters or modules. It's not obvious what its mesoscale structure is. And in fact, it has some very distinct clusters. So we can't rely on our visual instinct for defining a network's modules and its mesoscale structure. So in practice, what we have to do is we have to use a series of algorithms known as community detection algorithms to discover a network's community structure, to discover its mesoscale structure. This leaves a lot up to the user. The user has to determine, or the algorithm determines what the criteria is for defining a community. And it turns out that actually detecting the communities is a mathematically and computationally intractable problem. There's not a unique solution, and even if there is, it's very, very difficult to discover the optimal partition. And all of the approaches that we use in practice tend to be sensitive to parameters. There's a lot of challenges associated with discovering a network's community structure, its mesoscale structure. So what I want to talk about today and the rest of the talk, I want to introduce one strategy, one approach for getting at a network's communities that relies on the so-called modularity function. I'll walk through an example of how we apply modularity to discover the communities in a single layer structural connectivity network. I'll show that we can extend modularity to multi-layer networks, where instead of considering connections just among one group of nodes, we consider maybe multiple imaging modalities or that same set of nodes and their connections across time. I'm gonna give you an example of that too. And then I'll end with some thoughts and some additional reading considerations that we should keep in mind when we do community detection. So the goal of this talk is not to give you a definitive roadmap for how to do this. Rather, I would like to convince you that detecting communities, detecting a network's mesoscale structure is in fact hard. There's lots of decisions that need to be made along the way as a user, but ultimately, although these decisions make life challenging, it allows us to incorporate some of our own prior knowledge. The decisions make the methods flexible and capable of addressing very specific research questions. So I'll start with the modularity function and build up to this example with structural connectivity. So I mentioned earlier, there's lots of approaches for detecting communities and networks. A handful that you may be familiar with, like InfoMap, which is very popular, clique percolation, link communities, block models. All of these have been used both in the network science community and even in the network neuroscience community for detecting the mesoscale and community structure of networks. Likely the most popular, however, is modularity maximization. This is a technique that's been around now since at least 2004. And as you can see from the total number of citations, it's still quite popular. It's still being used frequently. And modularity maximization operates on an eminently simple principle. It defines communities to be groups of nodes that are more strongly connected to each other in the real network, in our observed network, than we would expect by chance. So I want to give you an intuition of what I mean by this. All right, so suppose we have some observed network, I'll call it A. This is a structural connectivity weighted adjacency matrix. To get modules using modularity maximization, we compare that observed network against what we would expect by chance, where chance is randomized networks that are generated according to some kind of null connectivity model. And if we were to generate lots and lots of networks according to that model, we'd get a matrix I'll call P, which encodes the expected weight of each connection under that model. So if we ran the model an infinite number of times and asked what's the expected weight of each edge in the network, that's what P tells us. And modularity maximization works by taking the difference in those two matrices. A minus P equals B. And B is something called the modularity matrix. And the goal then of modularity maximization is to take the elements of B, the ones that are red, that are stronger in the observed network than they are in the expected network, and put them inside clusters, inside the communities. So you see an example in the bottom right of a high quality partition and a low quality partition. On the right is high quality, and you can see inside the communities are lots of red elements. The stronger than expected connections are concentrated inside communities, whereas on the left, the low quality partition, there's a lot of red and blue inside communities. So we consider it bad in some way. We can formalize this intuition by considering the modularity quality function. Now, I won't go into too much detail, but it's worth knowing what modularity is. And modularity is this equation Q. Q is the quality of a partition. So what it does is it takes our observed connectivity matrix, that expected weight of connectivity. It focuses on the communities to which each node has been assigned. And effectively what it's doing is it's summing over all of the connections in the network. If two of those nodes, if the nodes that are connected are in the same community, then we add whatever their actual weight is minus the expected weight to some growing tally. And the goal is to make this growing tally, this total sum, as big as possible. And bigger values of Q intuitively mean better partitions. It's kind of the goodness or the quality of the partition. So we can use Q to grade how good a set of clusters are. And so the goal then, if we want to detect a network's communities, is to optimize Q. We want to choose community assignments, which in the previous equation I listed as G, the variable G, such that Q is as big as possible. And there's lots of approaches for doing this, but by far the most popular is something called the Levon algorithm. It's been demonstrated to be both fast and accurate on benchmark tests. And I won't go into too much detail about how it works, but it takes our network, it goes through a first pass where it assigns each node to a local optimum. It's choosing node communities, so it maximizes a local modularity. It aggregates those clusters to form meta nodes, right? So each cluster, each community becomes its own node, and then it repeats the algorithm, reclustering and aggregating until we get to a final step where we're left with a set of communities. And I should mention that this algorithm is implementable in the popular brain connectivity toolbox as the community Levon function, and it's implemented elsewhere. So you can use this quite easily right off the shelf. Okay, so how do we actually use modularity maximization? Well, we have our network. This is the same observed network as before, but the color map looks a little bit nicer with the structural connectivity matrix. We have our quality function for grading partitions, and we have an optimization algorithm, the Levon algorithm. So let's go through how we would actually put these things together to cluster the structural connectivity matrix and walk through some of the challenges that we might encounter along the way. Okay, so remember I promised there wouldn't be much more math, but remember our equation for modularity. Let's look at it just one more time. We have our observed matrix, our observed connectivity. Our goal is to find the values of G, the communities that maximize Q, but we're still left with this question of how do we define our null connectivity model? How do we define what P is? And it turns out, maybe not surprisingly, this is a non-trivial decision. After all, depending on what we put in that equation for P, it determines which connections are expected and which are unexpected, which in turn influence the optimal model or optimal modules. And so the likely answer to this is how do we choose a null connectivity model? There's probably not a singular optimal or correct answer. Rather, the correct null model depends on the research question and context. But there are some models that are frequently used. For instance, we can pretend that the connections are generated uniformly and randomly, so that the expected weight of a connection is uniform across all connections. We could try to preserve aspects of the original network, like nodes, degree, and strength sequence, but otherwise rewire connections. The so-called configuration model is good for that. And in fact, this is the model that's used most frequently, although there's some caveats if we want to apply it to functional connectivity data. But we can also incorporate anything we want into this null model, for instance, spatial relationships. So we can use geometric random graphs or gravity models that try to preserve the total cost of wiring or use information about nodes' positions in space to wire them together. Let's pretend now that, just for the sake of argument, that we've gone ahead, we're going to run our Levon algorithm with the degree preserving null model, the middle one. Okay, so we run it the first time. Here's our network on the left. The colored bar to the right indicates nodes community assignment, and it gives us a Q score of 0.4. Okay, we're pretty happy with that. The Q is not 0, which is good. When we reorder the network by communities, we see that the communities look internally dense and externally sparse. So they agree with our intuition of what a community should look like. But now imagine, just for fun, we run the algorithm again. Okay, well, in this case, we get a Q that's equal to the Q before. So these are two partitions that are of equal quality. But if we look at the community labels for the second run and the first differ. They're not the same. And the second one also even agrees with our intuition about what a community should look like. It's externally sparse, but internally dense. So how do we resolve this, or why is that? And the reason this happens is because it's actually a well-known phenomenon. It turns out there's something called a near-degeneracy of optimal partitions, which means there's some partition that's globally optimal, but there's a lot of partitions that are just about as good. A lot of communities are just about as good, but not quite as good, right? So there's cases where we have lots of partitions that are about equal quality, but they look different from each other. It turns out this has to do with the fact that if you have that optimal partition, you just swap one or two nodes community assignments, and you're still left with a really good partition, but slightly different and not optimal. So this is a problem, right? We have many similar but not identical partitions, and they all have approximately the same level of quality as indexed by the Q score. How do we go about resolving that? And you can see, if we were to repeat the algorithm more than twice, so we actually run it 1,000 times, we get variability in community assignments over time. So the way we resolve this is by building something called a community allegiance matrix. You'll see that on the right. And what that's doing, each element in that matrix counts how often out of those 1,000 runs were any pair of nodes assigned to the same community. So it's telling us kind of the consistency of community assignments. And what we do is we take that community allegiance matrix and we cluster it directly. So once we've ran our algorithm 1,000 times, we build the allegiance matrix and we cluster that. And this is a process known as consensus clustering, right? And our goal is to try to get what we call consensus communities, that are groups of nodes that have strong allegiance to each other on average. So they tend to be assigned to the same community frequently. And it's really simple to do this. We take our observed allegiance matrix, we randomly permute every node's module assignment and compute an expected allegiance matrix. Then we use modularity maximization just like before. We take our observed minus our expected, and then we define that to be our modularity matrix, run our Levon algorithm, say 1,000 times, and the tendency is for those partitions to come back looking highly similar. If they don't come back all identical, we repeat the process until they do. Right, so we get a perfect consensus matrix, perfect allegiance matrix, where there's total consensus across all of the runs. Okay, so now that we have consensus communities, you might think, well, we ought to be done by now, right? This is what we want. We have a set of communities and we're happy with them. Well, it turns out there's still another problem. Modularity maximization and a lot of other related community detection algorithms suffer from something called a resolution limit. And what that means is that even if a community, even if a small community is unambiguously defined, the quality function is actually blind to it. It is incapable of detecting small clusters. So I'll give you an example to try to build up this intuition. Here's a graph of a bunch of cliques that are linked to each other by one connection each. Now, if we were to run modularity maximization on a graph like this, we would expect that, or we would hope that we'd get back communities that look something like this, where the algorithm identifies each clique as its own community. But it turns out, for graphs of this type, of a given size, with a given number of cliques, we actually get merging, right? The algorithm is actually optimal from the perspective of maximizing Q to group pairs of cliques together. So we get some counterintuitive results when we actually use this algorithm in practice. And the caveat here is that the detected modules that we get by maximizing Q, they might not actually reflect a network's true or intuitive mesoscale structure. So that's a problem. Now, to circumvent this, there's a simple solution, and it's to parameterize our modularity equation. So here on the left is modularity, and on the right, you'll notice I've added a gamma function. This is our structural resolution parameter. And effectively what gamma does is it scales just how important that null model is, just how important P is in our Q equation, right? So when gamma is very small, most elements of A are bigger than expected. But as we make gamma bigger and bigger, fewer elements in our observed matrix exceed what we would expect. And this allows us to, by tuning gamma, selectively uncover communities of different size and number. So as we make gamma bigger, the number of modules, the number of communities that we detect increases, and their size decreases. This, of course, presents a challenge. If we want to do this kind of multi-scale community detection, this presents a challenge because we have added this new parameter whose value we have to fix somehow. We can do this lots of different ways by maximizing some additional heuristic, choosing a gamma that maximizes some additional heuristic. We can choose gamma via cross-validation, or if you're like me, you can just embrace the multi-scale nature of partitions and argue that the brain is probably not well described at a single scale, but is described at different scales. There's coarse modules that describe the brain's mesoscale structure, and also fine modules that describe the brain's mesoscale structure. But the important point is from a practical perspective, that value of gamma equals 1, which everybody loves. In fact, it's hardwired and hard-coded into some software packages. That value is not special. And in general, you must vary gamma. There's nothing special about gamma of 1. It's important to vary that number a little bit in any application. So a quick summary of this first part. There are many methods for studying a network's mesoscale structure. We focused on this modularity function Q. It's a function that judges how good or how objectively the quality of a partition. And larger values of Q correspond to internally dense and externally sparse communities. Now Maximizing Q directly is computationally challenging, so we'll never get the best solution. So we resort to heuristics like the Levon algorithm. And if we want to actually do this in practice, there's a few things that we need to consider, which include our choice of null model, the fact that most community detection algorithms for maximizing Q are non-deterministic. We need to take into account the fact that partitions are nearly degenerate. There's lots of near optimal solutions that are different from one another. And we need to take into account the scale or resolution at which we detect our modules. So that's a lot, but those are all important things that we need to consider when we actually perform community detection using modularity maximization or even InfoMap or other related methods. So that's the first part of the talk. And now I want to move on to the second component, which involves extending modularity maximization to multi-layer networks. And then I'll finish with a quick application to time-varying functional connectivity. So, as I said before, modularity maximization operates on this really simple principle. We compare what we see with what we'd expect. We try to cluster on the basis of that. Now, but the way I described this to you previously, the actual the equations, they only work for single layer networks, meaning we have one set of nodes connected to each other by one modality or at one point in time. But there's lots of examples in neuroscience and psychology where a network's connectivity information is encoded across different layers, right? So one common way that we can consider a multi-layer network is by thinking about dynamic or time-varying connectivity, right? So if we define a series of windows, time 1, we can build a network. Time 2, we have a slightly different network. Time 3, 4, we're building different networks at each instant, and they differ from one another. And we can think of each of these different connectivity matrices as a layer of sorts. There's lots of studies that have built multi-layer networks where the layers equal networks estimated at different points in time. We can also consider multi-layer networks where the different layers correspond to different association or connectivity modalities. For instance, we can link nodes to each other via functional connections based on their transcriptomic similarity or their structural connectivity, right? So it's the same set of nodes linked via different connection modalities. We could even consider layers to be different subjects, right? So each subject encodes a slightly different pattern of connectivity among the same nodes. But the point here is that there are lots of examples where connectivity information is not restricted to a single layer, to a single network. Now, if we want to track communities across layers, time, modalities, or individuals, how do we do this? Well, we can actually use one simple way to try to do this would be just simply average the layers, right? If you were to take all the layers and build an average network, you could use the same tools as before. But the problem with this is that when we average layers, of course, we are losing information. We're losing layer-specific information by collapsing them into a single network. So that's not good. But modularity maximization can actually come to our rescue here, right? Remember that all we need for modularity maximization to work is a modularity matrix and an optimization algorithm, right? So what if we did this? What if we took our layers, different connectivity modalities, and these are the time-varying networks that I showed from the previous slide. But if we took each of those networks, built their own modularity matrix, and then embedded them into this bigger object, this much larger matrix. So we put those modularity matrices along the diagonal. And then we could actually take this big matrix and give it as input to a modularity maximization algorithm, like the Levon algorithm. What would that do? Well, effectively nothing. Because there's no connections between layers. There's no reason for a node in layer 1 to ever be assigned to the same community as the node in layer 2, or layer 2 and 3, or 3 and 4. But we can start adding small amounts of weight between the layers. And what effectively this does is from the perspective of modularity maximization, it creates some incentive to group nodes in one layer with nodes in another, right? So there's a way to increase Q if we make these interlayer connections strong enough by merging communities across layers. So I'll show you how we do this in an example. So let's consider those time-varying networks I showed before. And what we'll do is we'll try to detect their communities and then look at which nodes communities vary across time. That is, which nodes communities are flexible. So the steps to do this are, one, to generate for each individual layer its own personalized modularity matrix, right? If we're considering functional connectivity, this is actually more complicated than the previous examples because there's signed connections in general, because like functional connectivity matrices tend to be correlation matrices. So we have to, in some way, take into account the positive and negative connections separately. And you'll see a reference in the bottom here to Gomez et al., which illustrates at least one very nice strategy for doing this, although there are many others. So we build a modularity matrix for each layer. Again, I won't go into details about how to build those modularity matrices. And then we have to choose how we add those interlayer connections. We're going to add something to this big modularity matrix. Because this is a time-varying example where each network is embedded in time as well, we're going to add what we call temporal interlayer links. So we're going to link layer 1 to layer 2. You see these red lines, layer 2 to layer 3, and layer 3 to layer 4. But I want to point out that there's nothing stopping us from doing what we'd call a categorical interlayer coupling, which is appropriate if there is no temporal information embedded in the networks. So here we are going to do this, the temporal interlayer coupling. We have to choose how strong we make that coupling, right? So if we make the coupling very weak, and you'll notice that I'm changing the size or the thickness of those lines. If I make the coupling very weak, the modules that we get back are going to emphasize the unique modular structure of each layer, right? It's going to, the unique components of layer 1 will tend to dominate, layer 2 will tend to dominate. But if we make those interlayer connections very strong, then the modules that we get back are going to emphasize the shared structure that's common across all layers. And I'll note as well that some of the same challenges that applied to single layer modularity maximization, they apply here as well. So we need to be very careful about our choice of null model. There's still a near-degeneracy of solutions, and there's a resolution limit as well. But if we were to then take that big matrix and feed it into, say, a Levon algorithm, it'll give us back something that looks like this. So what you're looking at here are layers and their community assignments. So this is not the 4 layers. I think this is something like 20 different layers now. But each column corresponds to a time point, and the colors indicate communities. And you see they change ever so slightly, so they're not identical across time. But if we want to figure out which brain areas change their communities, that is, which brain areas are flexible, we simply then compare successive layers and count and identify which nodes are changing. Where are their change points? That's what I'm showing here. Every red dot here represents the node whose community assignment changes from the previous layer. And we can just average those. And this is a measure called flexibility, which has been popularized in lots of papers, for example, from Danny Bassett's group at Penn. We can plot this back in the brain to identify where those flexible regions are. And if we were to run the algorithm many, many times and average flexibility, we get a much smoother and nicer picture. Now, I'll emphasize again that there's lots of free parameters here. And one that we need to be sensitive to is the interlayer coupling weight, right? If we make it very weak, the communities tend to change a lot from one layer to the other. But if we make it very, very strong, we're going to enforce lots of homogeneity across layers. There's very, very few changes. Something to be aware of. So a quick summary. Modularity maximization can be extended very easily to multi-layer networks. There's some additional considerations that we have to take into account anytime we do this. And this is how we define our interlayer coupling, whether it's categorical or temporal, and what the weight of that interlayer coupling should be. And just like with a single layer case, we need to think deeply about what null model we're using. We need to think deeply about the degeneracy of the solution landscape and the scale, the gamma value in which we're detecting communities. So I have one last slide, some additional reading, and then we'll wrap up. So really quickly, things that I didn't talk about here, but are nonetheless really important components of mesoscale structure analysis. I didn't talk much about how we compare communities from one person to the next. I did not talk about that. I never mentioned, but it's important to know, that totally random networks can have high values of Q. So Q in and of itself, although we use it as a proxy for the quality of a partition, its absolute value is totally meaningless, and it depends on lots of other properties of a network. Entirely random networks can have very big Q under certain circumstances. And I also didn't address any of the strategies for how to choose either the structural resolution parameter or the weights of interlayer coupling. But those are also important points. One other point that I'd like to make clear is that modularity maximization, as well as InfoMap, so the two most popular methods for detecting communities in network neuroscience, they make implicit assumptions about what the structure of communities should be. Specifically, they think that every community, that is the algorithm, is trying to identify communities that are assortative. That is, they are internally dense and externally sparse. This is a special case of mesoscale structure, and in reality, we can have very different classes of mesoscale structure. So you can have assortative, to be sure, but you can also have networks that exhibit core periphery mesoscale structure, where there's a strongly connected core that projects weakly to a periphery, and the periphery doesn't connect much to other peripheral nodes. We can have what's called a disassortative network, where rather than connections being concentrated within communities, they tend to fall between. Or we can even have mixtures of these three. And it's important to note this as a limitation of modularity maximization, that effectively we're only looking at, we will only discover this first kind of community. You'll never discover core periphery, disassortative, or a mixture with modularity maximization. And the final point that I wanted to make, and I think this motivates exploring lots of different methods besides modularity, is that community detection, just in general, as a problem, it is ill-posed and there's no unique solution. There's no truly unique optimal solution for how to partition a network. And the reason this is, if we think about the community detection problem, essentially what we want to do, what we're trying to solve is we have a network G of edges and their vertices, and we have a set of communities G, and we're assuming that there's some function that takes those communities and based on those communities gives us our network. That's the assumption that's built into every community detection algorithm, right? So again, here's our observed network. This is a function that generates the edges in our network, and those are those community assignments. And again, the goal of community detection is to try to figure out G, the lowercase g, the communities, given the network that we observe. So we're trying to invert this process, right? So essentially, we're trying to guess at what the generative process is of the network. We're trying to guess at what f to the -1 is. And it turns out this is really problematic because there might be many functions, and in general there are many functions, an arbitrary number of functions that could map the same set of communities to your network. So there might be different functions that do that. And similarly, there might be different communities that can get mapped to give the exact same observed network. So there is no unique solution. And this poses a problem for community detection, but it also motivates exploring many different methods. So again, here we focus on modularity maximization and talked a little bit about InfoMap. But if you want to do a really good job, you should not limit yourself to those two and consider others as well. Okay. So with that, I'll summarize really quickly, and then we'll finish up. So if you remember, what my goal today was, it was not to give you a definitive roadmap for detecting your network's modules or communities or mesoscale structure, but rather I hope that I convinced you that doing this, algorithmically detecting a network's communities and its modules is very hard. Right? There's lots of decisions that we need to make along the way about parameters, about appropriate null models. But ultimately, as challenging as these myriad decisions may be, the fact that we get to make decisions, the fact that we get to have a hand in the community detection process means that we can tailor it to answer specific research questions that are important to us and important to our research line. So with that, I'll say thank you, and I hope you found this informative.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for attending the talk today. My name is Anne Sizemore-Blevins. I am a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania with Danny Bassett. I'm really excited to talk to you today about multilayer networks. All right, so if you've been attending many of the other educational lectures today, specifically on network neuroscience, you'll probably have seen this general framework over and over again. So specifically, we start with some data here, perhaps some functional data where we're recording from these 4 different brain regions across time. So here we have a green, purple, red, and a blue region, and they have some activity across time. We'll represent that data as often a network, and the network is an example of a type of formalism we could use to represent this, the data. And then once it's in this formalism, we can use computational methods, again, talked about previously today, to then gain more insight into our actual system. So more specifically, what this has been looking like, this first data to formalism step, we have, for example, again, functional brain data. So perhaps we're just scanning someone. This is a resting state scan, and we'll encode this data using an adjacency matrix as a network. So a network, as you've heard of about earlier today, is composed of nodes, edges, and weights, where the nodes are just these little vertices, and the edges are a subset of vertex or pairs of vertices, and we can assign weights to these edges using the weighting function W, which assigns to each edge a real number generally. So in this case, the 4 brain regions have become 4 nodes, and I have connected 2 nodes if they are on at the same time at any point during the scan. So for example, here the blue and purple nodes are on, so they get an edge. And we often draw the network with sort of circles and lines, like on this top right portion, but we also represent it as the adjacency matrix. That's how we really perform computations on it, is through this adjacency matrix, which is we have n the number of nodes, and this will be an n by n matrix with a ij, so the ijth entry being the weight between the edge that connects vertex I and vertex J. So this is the adjacency matrix that represents this network here. And again, this is what we use to perform all of our computations. So once we have our data encoded as a network, we can do many great things from network science. Again, which you've heard of a lot about today. But some brief examples might be motif finding, or calculating centrality, or of course, community detection, looking for functional or structural modules within the brain. But all of these computations have a goal of understanding better the behavior or the functions of different parts or groups of brain regions. So for example, if we take our data, we then encode it as this network, then the idea is that at the end of the day, after we run these computations, we'll have a better understanding of the behavior, for example, of this green node, the behavior of the pink purple node, and so on. Okay, so in this presentation, let's talk about what happens if we have some more complicated data. So one example might be recording, but recording over different tasks. So here, an example would be a recording over 4 different tasks, and they're sort of broken up by columns up here. So how would we try to, can we force this into, a network representation? Well, what we really like to capture is both connections and structure within a certain task, and then how the structure changes or doesn't change across tasks. So what we really want is actually something like where we have multiple networks here. I've only shown 3, but you can imagine all 4 of them, where we're connecting nodes based on their coactivity during one of the tasks. But then we also understand how these networks change and differ across tasks. So this doesn't quite fit into the one network kind of framework that we've seen previously. Consider instead we have one individual, but we have both functional and structural data for this individual. So here we have the actual white matter tracks, perhaps from DTI imaging, that show the structural connections between the functional or between these brain regions. But we also have some functional information as well. So we have the activity across time. So here we might want to understand again both how the network of brain regions and their structural connections is set up, but also how the functional network is connected, and then how the physical and the functional networks interrelate between each other. Again, another example where we're going to need more than one network. If you're into looking at the structural brain network, you'll know that oftentimes we need to parcellate the node or the brain data. So for example, we might have the option to use a coarse parcellation or a very fine parcellation. So here I've indicated that this green node on the left in the coarse parcellation is some sort of large brain region. And then in the fine scale parcellation, we actually have this broken up into 3 different regions, which means that this, what will be this network over here, has many more nodes than the first parcellation. So in this case, we don't just have 2 networks with the same number of nodes, we have different numbers of nodes in each of these. And then we have lots of connections between the 2. Finally, we might be recording activity from different brain regions. And oftentimes, it's very important to understand how brain regions or areas interact with each other in the different frequency bands. So we could split this up by frequency bands and look at how brain regions or areas interact with each other in one particular frequency band, a second frequency band, and then any cross-frequency correlations. So all these examples need something more than one network. What they need is a formalism called a multi-layer network. So those who study multi-layer networks often refer to just a single network as a simplex network. So we have multi-layer network, which is where we have lots of these all connected. And then we have a simplex network, which is what we've been talking about most of today. So today, I'll take you through a brief introduction to multi-layer networks. In particular, I'm going to start with the simplest type of multi-layer network called a multiplex network. I'll talk about how it generalizes towards the end. But again, because this is just a brief sort of get your feet wet sort of introduction, and we'll start with the simplest case. All right, so what is a multiplex network? Well, similarly to a simplex network, a multiplex network is a tuple of node set, which is V, or vertex set, the edges, the set of edges, which is E, a weighting function, W, but it also has this 4th term, the labeling function, L. So that just as before, we have our edges, a subset of V cross V. So in particular, the vertices here are not just, well, there are 20 vertices here. It's every dot you see. So there are 10 that are colored green and 10 that are colored blue. Our weighting function is, again, from the edges to R, just as before. But then we have this labeling function L. This is where the multiplex network or the multi-layer network really starts to shine. So for every single vertex in our multiplex network, we're going to assign to it a sequence of labels, basically. So these labels are a set, or well, cross product of different categories, basically. And if there are D categories, each called a dimension, so there are D dimensions here, then we have this D-dimensional multiplex network. So what that looks like for this particular example is that for any vertex, we're going for any vertex, we assign to it the sequence of labels. So we're assigning to this vertex all of their labels, basically saying that they're the same. Now for this particular example, we have two dimensions, or two aspects sometimes they're called, where the first one, L1, is a set of just numbers 1 to 10. So I've just marked each of these nodes on the right with a number from 1 to 10. And then the second dimension is this either A or B, or you can it's colored by blue or green. So for example, this V1 over here is associated with the labels 1, A. V2, which is down here, gets the labels 1, B. V3 we associate with 2, A, and V4 over here, V2, B. So in general, there are often actually multiple definitions for a multi-layer network. And if you'd like to learn more specifically about the language that I'm using, please see this review about multi-layer brain networks. But in general, I will not use too much more rigorous math than what we've seen here, and mostly explain concepts intuitively. One of the greatest things about multi-layer or multiplex networks is the ability to slice the data in these different dimensions. So usually we see a multi-layer network or a multiplex network shown in this way, like we have on the right, where we have sort of two colors, and we're colored, the nodes and these sort of boxes are colored by L2. But we can just as easily color and slice by L1. So here I have every node colored according to its value from the L1 dimension. And we'll see a little bit more of this later, but it just shows the flexibility of this modeling framework. So far I've said, well, there are multiple layers, but I've really only shown you two, but we can just as easily encode many layers into our multi-layer network framework, or a multiplex network framework. So in this case, where we have these 5 layers in the second dimension, we have everything as before, our labeling function, and then labels, remember, still 2 dimensions here. Just L2 contains A, B, C, D, and E, which is why we have these 5 slices. Perhaps the most common example of a multiplex or multi-layer network is a temporal network, where we have, it's generally assumed to be one network that evolves across time, specifically forward in time. So here in this example, I have a network that begins at this time point, and then we're adding, in general, more and more edges. The average edge density is increasing. And these temporal networks are actually another type of multi-layer networks that have to do, of course, with the network changing over time. But we can, again, encode it using our multi-layer tools. So here we have, again, 2 dimensions. L1, the labeling of the nodes as before, and then L2 we just rewrote as T. Now T is a set of time points in which we recorded our data, so T0, T1, etc. And so each vertex in this whole multi-layer network or multiplex network is associated with a number or from L1, and then a time point. So this is V1 is 1T0, V2 1T1, and so on. So I told you that these multiplex networks are special. They're a special type of multi-layer networks. In particular, a multiplex network is a special type of multi-layer network in which every node exists in every single layer, and nodes connect only to themselves in each layer. So for example, here, every node in this green layer has one and only one edge shooting directly up above it to one node in the blue layer. Again, this is the most common, but we can be a lot more general. So in general, multi-layer networks can encode situations where we have nodes connecting to whatever other node they please in other layers. So this brings us back to the frequency band example from before, and you can see examples of this in the papers down at the bottom right. But in general, the multi-layer network framework is just as happy to encode systems like this, in which nodes in, for example, the orange layer can connect to any node, any number of nodes they please in the pink layer. Additionally, if we think back to our parcellation example, multilayer networks can also encode these sort of data because they don't require that nodes exist in every single layer. So on the right, we have a multilayer network in which there are 10 nodes on the top, but only 8 nodes on the bottom, on the orange layer, and 7 in the green layer. So this blue node does not have a sort of counterpart in the orange layer or the green layer. All right, so we've talked now about the formalism of multilayer networks, and in particular how they can encode some other systems. Especially they're able to encode more of the details and the holistic structure of the system instead of collapsing out some of those sort of interlayer connections if we try to collapse all of the system into a simplex network. So now let's move on to talking a little bit about how we get from our data to the multilayer network. And very similarly to the simplex network case, we have an adjacency matrix, but here called a Supra adjacency matrix. So if we have this multi-layer network on the left, recall the vertex set is called a V. We have the Supra adjacency matrix is a matrix, again, indexed by the vertices, and the ijth entry is the weight between the edge the edge between vertex I and vertex J. So very similarly to before, but oftentimes, especially when we have these multiplex networks, the Supra adjacency matrix sort of looks like a few regular adjacency matrices along the diagonal, and then these diagonal lines, or these little identity matrices here. These just indicate that nodes in the layer A are connecting to a copy of themselves in layer B. Now again, it's quite common to organize the Supra adjacency matrix by the second level, but again, we could just as easily reorder the matrix so that it's organized by the first dimension. Additionally, multilayer networks are well encoded by tensors, but again, just for this introduction talk, I'll leave it at Supra adjacency matrices. For another example of a Supra adjacency matrix, these can get quite large. Here's the one corresponding to this temporal network. In particular here, I've said each node connects to itself in all of the other layers. In some cases, it might be better to have the nodes in T0 connect only to themselves in T1, so and only the time point just after. All right, so then finally moving from formalism to insight, what can we do once we have our data encoded as a multilayer network? Well, many of the things we know and love from network science. So sometimes multilayer or multiplex is abbreviated as MX, which I've done here. So we can do multilayer network analyses. For example, as before, we can find motifs, multilayer motifs. We can compute multilayer network centrality, and we can detect multilayer communities, all with hopes of better understanding the behavior of the brain. So just to give you some idea of what these are like. So for example, motifs and multilayer networks. Let's say we have a multilayer network. Well, looks like a multiplex network here, in which we have brain regions, but we also have the second dimension of both structure and function. And this is based on this 2017 paper, where they looked at how motifs in this structure function brain network. Specifically here, I've called out a motif in which both the edges exist in the structural and the functional network, which is highlighted here. And in this paper, they found that in general, the presence of one of these edges made the presence of the other edge more likely. For centrality in multilayer networks, we can use many of the same algorithms that we know and love from network science. So here, for example, is taking a random walk on a multilayer network on the right. And we can use random walks or Pagerank to compute centrality. We can use Pagerank centrality or eigenvector centrality, so on. One example of centrality at work in multilayer networks is in this Domenico et al.'s 2016 paper, in which they used, or in which they first computed multilayer network node centrality and found that the hubs computed in that way differed from those computed from simplex network measures. And also they were able to use these hubs to distinguish between individuals with schizophrenia and healthy controls. Finally, we can, of course, detect communities in multilayer networks. So communities is generally accepted to be a group of nodes that are densely connected to themselves. And oftentimes we have that they are not connected as densely to other nodes in the network. So for a multi-layer network, you might want a community of nodes to be tightly connected in all of the layers and then tightly connected to each other in different layers. So one example of community detection of multi-layer networks is from this Bassett 2015 paper, in which they used temporal community detection, which again is a form of multi-layer community detection, to better understand the way that the visual and motor systems sort of separate from each other throughout learning of a motor task. So looking forward, there are many exciting avenues for multi-layer networks, just from first encoding your data that way and pushing the formalism forward in that regards, but also with methods and other techniques. So I'd like to end by talking over a few ways that we can continue to push this formalism into the future and to develop it so it can become even a better tool for understanding brain data. So first, as suggested in this 2018 review, we can use more than 2 dimensions. So every example you've seen so far has been where the collection of labels has only 2 dimensions, just L1 cross L2. What if we had this third one? So for example, this is often the case, we can use L1 as brain regions, L2 as time, but then we also are going to record for multiple subjects, so L3 could be subjects. So in this case, instead of building one temporal network for each subject, we're going to build one large multi-layer network that includes all of our data. And then, because of the flexibility of this framework, we can slice the data however we please, and it all sort of stays within this one large structure. So for example, on the right, this figure is showing one example of slicing using just one time point. So we'll look at all the brain regions and all the subjects, but just at one time point. In panel B, you'll see that we're using just one subject. So here we have brain regions across time. And then in panel C, we have one brain region, but we're looking at how that brain region evolves across subjects and across time. We can also look at dynamics on multi-layer networks, again, which is just beginning. But since multi-layer networks can encode different types of edges, we can use this power to have more accurate dynamical models of our systems. So one example might be to have one layer be the actual structure or neurons firing and interacting together, and another layer being the resources. So the resources themselves have their own dynamics, the neurons have their own dynamics, and then there's some sort of interaction between these 2 layers, and these can all be tuned. And based on the tuning and how levels interact, you can get many sort of interesting behaviors. Additionally, so far we've only talked about dyadic relations within this presentation. So specifically, the assumption that a node only connects with one other node, or a relationship can only exist between 2 nodes. But in many systems, there actually exist polyadic relations in which many nodes can be related together. So in those situations, we might want to use a hypergraph or a simplicial complex. This multi-layer concept can extend just as easily to hypergraphs or simplicial complexes. One example is from this 2013 paper in which they're using a multi-layer hypergraph. Finally, my opinion, one of the most entertaining challenges is how to visualize multi-layer networks. These are huge multidimensional structures oftentimes, and trying to figure out a way to appropriately illustrate them is a really cool challenge. So in general, we see multi-layer networks, as I've showed you throughout most of the paper, where we have sort of different layers all sliced together. But that's only most appropriate for very small multi-layer networks. When you have many, many nodes, then we might need to change to something else. For example, have the nodes aligned in columns, or something like this hive plot here. So these different sorts of visualizations were reviewed in this Minky paper from 2019. So finally, I will leave you with a bunch of code and software from Python, R, and Julia to help you get started with your own multi-layer network analyses. But before I leave you, I want to say first thank you to everyone who helped out with the creation of this presentation and the editing. And I also want to say that almost all of these slides were generated from code that's available on GitHub. So if you're interested in generating any of these networks that you see throughout the slides, any slide that has this little asterisk on the top right-hand corner was generated directly from this code. And that's, again, freely available here. So with that, I want to say thank you again for listening. I'm excited to take any of your questions, and have a great day. Thank you.
Welcome. My name is Martijn van der Heuvel. I am a computational neuroscientist working at the VU in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about hubs in networks, and in particular brain networks, and how these hubs might play an important role in central communication and neural integration of information within brain systems. In the previous talks, we have talked about the brain showing this modular organization with multiple subsystems being formed, with potentially these subsystems forming the infrastructure for specialized brain functionality. Now, the brain being formed, or the brain forming different separate subsystems, of course, cannot explain the total level of complexity of neural connectivity. And indeed, in many of those systems, we see that these integrative systems, these modules, these communities important for specialized brain functionality, in the end also have to integrate their information and share their information to get the total information to a higher level of integration. And in many systems, so-called hubs form these important central places where a lot of connectivity merges together. And as such, they form the infrastructure for neural communication and integration. For example, if you take a look at the road networks, then there are central points within those networks where multiple roads come together. Well, the same holds for social networks. We all know that we all know a few friends that have many more connections than others, and actually form some bridges between otherwise separate social communities. And finally, as a final example, in computer networks, hubs play a crucial role, of course, in connecting different subsystems together. Now, in a similar way, hubs are also discussed in a wide range of biological networks, including, of course, the nervous systems. And here too, these hubs, these central points for communication and integration, or at least central points where connectivity, a lot of connectivity comes together, these hubs tend to be present across a wide range of scales of organization of these systems. For example, in gene-gene interaction networks, hubs might play an important role in forming central pathways of gene-gene interactions. At the neuronal level, hub neurons play an important role in facilitating local information integration. At the mesoscale and microscale, hub areas and hub brain regions might form an important role for global neural communication and integration. And in many systems, actually, many brains, they have been noted to be overlapping to well-known association regions of the brain. And finally, also at the behavioral level, we can see that there might be hubs forming some types of behavior that are much more global and interactive with other types of behavior. So in this talk, we want to talk in particular about these hubs at the network level. So we want to discuss what are hubs, what types of metrics of centrality do we have to detect hubs, what types of categorization can we have of hubs. We can connect them into so-called connector hubs and provincial hubs. What type of relationships might there be within a network between hubs? We will talk about the core and the rich club. We will briefly talk about how we can compare hubs across populations. For example, if we are interested in doing a control patient comparison. And finally, we're going to end with some general things to think about when we examine hubs, and also discuss a few limitations and caveats of hub analysis. So what are hubs? Well, hubs, and in particular the hub organization of a network, was one of the first introductions of this was by Barabasi in 1999 in a science publication, a very well-known publication. So what he noticed is that random networks, meaning networks in which every node has an equal probability of being connected to a random other node in the network, then if we would look at the degree distribution, this forms a bell-shaped curve. On average, every node has roughly the same number of connections with a slight variation. However, in many natural networks, the degree distribution is not bell-shaped, meaning that on average nodes do not have the same level of connections, but in many real-world networks, actually the far majority of nodes only have a few connections, but with the existence of just a few nodes that have many more connections than the average node in the network. And actually, if you put the degree distribution on a log-log scale, Barabasi noticed that many networks actually form a linear curve. So this means that if we look at the histogram of the degree distribution, right, so in here, we just simply count for every one of the nodes the number of connections that this node has, that this degree distribution should have either a 1 over f drop-off, which would reflect a linear line on the log-log scale, or in a more liberal way, we would say it has a heavy tail. Meaning that there are some nodes in the network that have many more connections than others, and these nodes might form, given that they have such a high level of connectivity, might form the hubs in our network. So what type of metrics do we have to detect this hubness, if you will? Metrics of centrality. Well, let's introduce a simple toy network here. You can see here a simple graph with a few nodes and the number of connections between them. And of course, how these connections are placed define the topological structure of our network. Now we could argue that, in particular, these nodes here, for example, would reflect a relatively high level of centrality in the network, because these three nodes here are crucially important for forming some sort of a bridge between this part of the network and this part of the network. So there are four, or there are actually many, but let's take a look at four often used metrics of centrality to detect these central nodes in the network. Well, the first metric is what we would call degree centrality. This is the most simplest metric. We count for every one of the nodes the number of connections that it has, and then we select the most dense connected or the most highly connected nodes of the network as the ones with the highest level of centrality. So this would be degree centrality. In a slightly more advanced way, we could also argue that we should not only look at the direct connections of nodes, but also at the indirect connections that nodes can have and how central a node is in the network in terms of total communication. Well, this can be captured by closeness centrality, meaning that if we compute the travel distance from every node to every other node in the network by means of the shortest path, then we can select those nodes that are the most central, the nodes that have the shortest communication distance to every other node in the network, that these nodes might be our preferred hubs. Even more slightly advanced would be if we do not only take into account the shortest path from a node to our node of interest, but also if we would take into account all communication paths, all short communication paths within the network, and then we count for every node how many times this node is participating in such a communication path. If we do this for all paths and for all nodes, we can then select the nodes with the highest betweenness as the nodes that are the most central in the network. And finally, a metric that is often also examined is the so-called eigenvector centrality, or a close cousin of this, the Pagerank centrality. So the idea with the eigenvector centrality and the Pagerank centrality is that we find those nodes in the network to be highly central and important if also the direct neighbors of that node also have a high level of importance. Well, a quick mathematical trick for this is actually, if we would take the adjacency matrix that fits to our network of interest, so in this simple case, our simple graph, there's of course an adjacency matrix describing all of the interactions between the nodes of the network. And given that this is an adjacency matrix, we can compute the eigenvectors and the eigenvalues of that matrix. And interestingly, the eigenvector that is fitted to the largest, or actually the smallest, in some other cases, eigenvalue, this one would reflect the eigenvector centrality of our graph. And this depicts actually the importance of a node given the importance of its direct connected neighbors. Now we can also compare this eigenvector centrality actually to a random walker in the network. So if we have our simple Tor graph here, and then if we would start a traveling particle in a certain seed node, and then we let this particle randomly walk across the network. So in this case, at start, this seed can either go this way or this way, so there is a 50-50 chance of taking one of these connections and traveling to the other node. Assuming that our random walker has taken this one, again, there's a 50-50 chance traveling again and again over the network. Now, if we would do this continuously, and then we would count how many times the random walker crossed the nodes in the network, then in the end, this distribution would actually give us a good indication of the nodes that have passed the most by this random walker would actually be the most central nodes in our network. Now, this is indeed very close to the closeness centrality metric in our network. And interestingly, when people started to examine this in terms of nervous systems, people have noticed that indeed nodes with a high eigenvector centrality, or a high centrality in the overall network, might also have particular central roles in the behavioral spectrum of the animal. There was a fantastic paper by Boombacher and colleagues in this, where they compared a part of the nervous system between the C. elegans worm and the P. pacificus worm, and found that the centrality of certain nodes might be directly related to specific type of behavior and differences in behavior between these two worm species. A very interesting paper and a very interesting application of this centrality metric directly linking into behavior. So to summarize, right, we have seen that there might be multiple ways of defining the centrality of a node depending on different types of definitions. And interestingly, these different types of metrics that are not completely independent from each other, right? We could also see them on some sort of a spectrum. And on one end, we could take, for example, degree centrality as a simple metric of a random walker, or a walker in the network to be able to take one particular step in the network, and then the nodes with actually can reach the highest number of other nodes would be the most central. This would be a definition of degree centrality. Well, this, of course, would be what we would call routed transmission of information through the network. If we take one more level of complexity, we can take, for example, between a centrality or closeness centrality as a metric of how easy a certain node can send information to all of the other nodes in the network, or how important this node is in all terms of short communication path in a network. And this would still, of course, assume a form of routed type of information transfer in the network. Now, if we would go all the way to the complete other scale of types of communication in the network, namely diffusion type of communication, in which the information is actually randomly diffused across the network, in which the walker has no information about the underlying structure of the network. Then we would actually much more select our central nodes based on eigenvector centrality. Right, so here we can clearly see that these different types of metrics on centrality, although they might reflect different types of structure of the network and reflect different roles of certain nodes in the network, they are, in a sense, or they can be placed on a certain type of spectrum related to the different types of communication that we find important in the network. Now, as a final note, which metric do we take if we want to select our central hubs? Well, you can, of course, depending on your research question, and as we have also seen in the previous slides, the type of communication that you are most interested in your specific research question, depict your metric of centrality. But you can, of course, also actually not just select nodes based on one metric, but you can, of course, also combine different metrics to select the nodes of most centrality. Or you can actually also put some sort of saying, you know what, a node should not have a certain property XYZ. For example, you can argue that a central node should not have a specific high level of centrality, or not have a specific level of local communication or local connectivity in the network. Now, this is, of course, completely up to your specific type of research question, which metric you want to take. So once we have selected the hubs, we can further try to categorize them. So let's again go back to our simple Tor network, and then paint on top of the network structure also the different types of modules that we can detect in the network. So you can clearly see here that this network is depicted into 3 subgraphs. Now we can then argue that if we take a look at these 2 specific nodes, the orange one and the yellow one, that although they might be both representing high degree nodes, so they might be, based on the centrality, be identified as a hub, they might have a completely different role in the network. So this node here would much more function as we would call a provincial hub, right? It is a node that has a specific role in its local subnetwork, while the yellow node actually is much more a bridge connecting different modules in the network. So put differently, if we would identify or categorize our hubs, which we first selected based on degree, but then if we would we further categorize them, we could argue that the orange node mostly has intramodular connections, while the yellow node has mostly intermodular connections. And then based on that, we can call the orange node a provincial hub and the yellow node much more of a connector hub. Well, this was nicely formalized by Gamera and colleagues, in which they said, you know what, we can compute for every node in the network, in particular the high degree nodes in the network, their so-called within module degree z-score, which is how many connections does a certain node in a certain module has compared to the degree of those nodes, of the other nodes in that module. And then if a node stands out in terms of its intermodular degree of that particular module, then we could, this high within degree z-score might indicate that this node is indeed important in terms of its central connectivity within that particular module. Now we can also grasp the level of participation of a node in connectivity to multiple modules in terms of computation of the participation coefficient. So here the idea is that for every node in the network, we count to how equally its connections are distributed across all of the existing modules in the network. And if a node actually has a high equal distribution of its connections across all of the different modules in the network, in that way, this would be reflected in a high participation coefficient, indicative of this node to be a potential player in connecting the different modules of the network. So Gamera and colleagues then nicely said, you know what, if we would compute for every high-degree node in the network its participation coefficient and its within modular degree z-score, we can put these on an actual system, and then we get some sort of a space with different sub-areas within that space indicating whether a node is much more a connector hub or a provincial hub node. So on one end here we have the x-axis with the participation coefficient, and on the y-axis here we have the within modular degree z-score reflecting the importance of a certain node within its own module. Now let's take a look at this dark orange node here then. Where would it be positioned in this space? So what do you think? Would it be at R2 in this area here? Would it be in R5 in this area here? Or in R3 in this area here? Well, we could place, or actually the orange node would be placed in R5 because it has a relatively high degree z-score. It has much more connections on average than the other nodes within its module. But the participation coefficient is relatively low because actually all of its connections are just distributed across only one module in the network. So it has a low participation coefficient. In contrast, where would we place the yellow node? Again, would you place it in R5, R4, or in R6? Well, the yellow node would actually be positioned in R6. Here too, compared to the other nodes in its module, it has a relatively high within module z-score. It has 2 connections to the other nodes, and this one also has a degree of 2. So it would be averagely placed, I would say, a relatively normal within modular degree z-score, not super high, but also not super low. But the participation coefficient is relatively high because from this node here, actually 2 of its connections are placed to this module, 1 to this module, and 1 to this module. So now we can actually compute for all of the nodes in the networks their participation coefficient P and their within modular degree z-score. And we can then further subdivide the particularly high degree nodes in the network, or the nodes that we selected with a high centrality, and then we can further categorize them based on this space on whether they would reflect mostly provincial hub nodes or much more connector hub nodes. Now, just as a side note here, right, we have selected so far and looked at mostly the centrality of nodes within the network and further categorization of these nodes in terms of their intra and intermodular behavior. But just as a note, we can of course do the same thing with the edges of the network. For example, we can compute the level of edge between us, how central is a certain edge within the overall network structure. And this would give us an indication not just of particularly the nodes, how central they are in the network, but also how important are specific edges within the network. Now, one particular class of edge metrics that we have been working on is the so-called edge removal metrics. So the idea with the edge removal metric is that you systematically remove an edge of the network and then you evaluate the influence of this removal of this edge on the global network topology. So for example, we can compute first the overall clustering or overall global efficiency of our network, including all edges. Then we can remove an edge. We can then again compute the level of global efficiency, and then we can compute the effect of the removal of that particular edge in the network on the effect of the global efficiency. Now again, we can do this for all edges in the network, and then of course we can select those edges that would have the strongest effect when they are removed or when they are damaged on the overall network efficiency. Now this of course would also be a metric of centrality, but now a metric of edge centrality. So now that we have selected the hubs and we have further categorized them, let's take a look at their potential relationships that might exist among hubs. How are hubs themselves connected and how they might further form some sort of units within the overall network structure. Now, 2 particular network types of hub interactions that are worth to discuss are so-called core and rich club organization. Now, the core of a network is the subset of nodes that have among themselves a certain level of degree. So the three core of a network here are these nodes here, because among them they all have a shared degree of 3. Now, as such, a X core would give an indication of some sort of an onion layered structure of the network and the most central internally connected nodes of the network. And indeed, when applied to, for example, the human brain, this has provided some very interesting new results on the human brain network to show a certain type of core structure with high degree nodes forming a central a system within the overall brain network. Now, a related, but certainly not the same concept is the rich glob. So the idea with the rich glob can be best depicted as follows. So let's assume that we have a simple Tor network here and we select the most high degree nodes. Then the question is, how are these high degree nodes connected to each other? They could be below averagely connected, meaning that they have a number of connections between them that is below what you would expect on the average degree of the network. They could be averagely connected, meaning that, sure, they have a number of connections, and they're all high degree, so the probability of them becoming connected is, of course, there, but it's still average. Or they could actually be well above average, meaning that the network, for some reason, has invested a lot of connectivity between these centrally connected nodes to form some sort of a central structure within the overall network. Now, Kalisa and colleagues nicely formalized this, saying, you know what, we can compute this type of behavior by saying we can select a certain subset of nodes with a certain degree in the network, and then we can count the number of edges that are actually present between that subset, divided by the total number of possibilities that this subset of nodes could have in terms of connectivity, which would be the maximum level of connections that could be present between that subset of nodes. Now we can then do this for every level of degree k, and then we can put this into a figure. So what you see here on the x-axis is the level of degree. So that would mean that if we take 20, that means that we take the subset of nodes with 20 or more connections in the network, and then we count the number of connections between those nodes, divide that by the total number of possible connections that could exist between that subset of nodes. Now, if we do that for a simple network, for example, our brain network, which is depicted here in black, then indeed we see that the average number of connections between between subset of nodes with increasing k would indeed increase across degree. Now this is interesting because this means that there is indeed a higher level of connectivity present between nodes with a higher degree. But it is important here to benchmark this to a situation that would not be of our interest. Meaning that if we would take a random network, meaning if we would take actually our network of interest, but then randomly distribute the connections across our network, keeping, of course, the degree distribution, so preserving for every node of the network its initial degree k, then here too we would see that in this random situation, the number of connections between those nodes would still increase. And this is because, well, if you have two nodes with a high degree of a high number of connections, then if we randomly shuffle those connections across the network, then there is, of course, a high probability of those still high degree nodes to be connected to each other. Because they're high degree, they should somewhere place their connections. So that's why the normalized rich group coefficient was introduced, arguing that we should particularly look at the difference or the ratio between the actual situation and the randomized situation, because the randomized situation would simply be the null level of connectivity between the high degree nodes. And if this ratio would be higher than 1, that means that our network of interest would indeed have a certain range of k in which there is indeed a much higher level of connectivity than we would expect, simply based on the degree of our random situation. So that's why we always take our network of interest, in our case the brain, and benchmark to the random network. And then it's the ratio, the normalized rich group coefficient, but this ratio between our network of interest and our random network, that would give us a potential indication of the level of high degree connectivity between the high degree nodes. Now, alternatively, of course, we can also select our nodes not just based on degree, but also by means of other terms of centrality, as we've seen before. So people have suggested that we can also take the level of centrality in terms of participation coefficient, which would give us an indication of a certain diverse glob, or some metrics of how well nodes can integrate information in terms of mathematical models. And this would give us, for example, information on how well nodes important for binding information in the network would be connected to each other. Now, it is of course important to note here again that the benchmarking to the node model is of crucial importance. So within the rich glob, it is quite easy to do because we can preserve the degree distribution, but the more complex metric of centrality we take, of course, the more complex our random node models should be. So at the end of this talk, let's briefly discuss two final important things. One, how can we compare hubs across populations if we want to do a patient control comparison? And finally, what are some final limitations and caveats of these methods that we discussed so far? But let's first take a look at a proper way or some suggested ways to compare hub organization across populations. Well, the simple way, of course, would just be compare nodal degree or nodal participation coefficient or nodal centrality score, and then per node do a for example, a t-test or a permutation test between our controls and patients. And this is a very often a common way to do. But there are also more advanced ways. One method was introduced by Tremanen and colleagues in which they said, you know what, we can also for every individual compare how well its degree distribution of that particular individual would actually fit what we would expect on a healthy degree distribution. So this means we first we compute the degree distribution on a population of healthy controls, could be, for example, ACP subjects. And then for every participant in our subject on the healthy controls, we compute how well their degree distribution of that individual actually fits to what we would expect in the healthy situation. We can then also do that for our patients, and as a result, if that fit is less well, right, if the correlation of our patient fits less well to our healthy degree distribution, we can take that as an index of how our hub distribution is disrupted in the network. And they introduced a hub disruption index for this. So let's end by also discussing, of course, some limitations and caveats of hub investigations of networks, and in particular also hub comparison. A first important note was made by Jonathan Power and colleagues a couple of years ago, noting that if we in particular take a look at functional degree hubs, right, so these would be the hubs based on functional connectivity, then we should also take into account that we, of course, if we have a network with a certain modular organization, that the varying size of the different communities in a network might be an important driver for functional connectivity degree. So what he noticed is the following. So if we have a simple graph here, a simple toy network here, based on functional connectivity, then if we would have a certain community within the network, then within functional degree, this means that this community was detected because the nodes of that particular module would have a high level of connections between them. Because that's how we actually select, that's how the modular detection algorithm works. Now, most of these connections are short range, and therefore they are also mostly high functional connectivity. And in the end, this is of course the driver for our modular detection algorithm. But in contrast, if we would have a community that is smaller, that means there are smaller in size, that means there are simply less nodes within that module. This also means that there are less connections within that module. So the degree of this particular nodes in this module here would be, by definition, lower than the degree of the nodes in the larger community. And this is, of course, because the long-range connections that would have mostly low functional connectivity, so the cross-modular connections, they do not survive within this modular detection. And in particular also most often in the thresholding that takes place before the modular detection. So in other words, if you have a node within a larger community, it will end up with a higher degree K compared to the communities that are smaller. So if we would then take a top 10% of nodes being selected as the ones with the highest degree as our hubs of our network, then there will be an overrepresentation of nodes within the larger communities. And Power nicely formalized this and investigated it, showing that indeed, if you look at resting state networks that are much larger, for example, the full one network, there seems to be an overrepresentation of hub nodes within those larger communities and these larger resting state networks. A second property that we would be worth to discuss and take into account when you do functional degree and structural degree connectivity studies is the following, namely the influence of so-called false positive and false negative edges on degree. So Andreas Zaleski published this very nice paper a couple of years ago on the effect of false positive and false negative reconstructions on graph metrics. And I highly encourage you to read this paper in more detail, but the overall message here was that false positive and false negatives do not have a similar contribution on disrupting the network structure. Actually, false positives unfortunately have a much stronger effect on some global metrics of the network than false negatives. And then we took this concept and looked indeed on this effect when we do a control patient population study. Indeed, what we noticed is that the effects of proportional thresholding, meaning selecting the top X% of most strongest connections in the network, would have a profound effect on the computation and therefore also subsequent comparison of our graph metrics between our patients and controls. Now we put this into a different paper, in a neuroimage paper in 2017, and here the overall conclusion was that if we have a patient population which on average have lower functional connectivity, potentially because of their disease process, then lower functional connectivity would likely to have a few more false positives. Now, false positives have a more effect on false negatives, and as a result, the network overall will become slightly more random. And as a result, our patients are most often seen to reflect a more random network structure, while actually they're showing a lower functional connectivity level of structure. So what does this mean in terms of hubs? Well, we know that random networks have slightly different degree distribution, because that's what we started with this discussion in when we discussed in the beginning of the talk the nice paper by Barabazi and colleagues. Actually, random networks tend to have less hubs. The degree seems to be more equally distributed. So this means that if we would have a network with lower functional connectivity with slightly more false positives in, for example, our patient population compared to our control population, having a more random distribution will also mean that there might be less hubs in the network, and as a result, we might, somewhat falsely, conclude that our patients with lower functional connectivity networks would also have a lower or a changed degree distribution. And we would argue that there might be less hubs in patients, but actually this is mostly driven by them having lower functional connectivity on average, not because hubs themselves would have lower functional connectivity in patients specifically. So this is something to take care of when you want to perform functional degree comparisons between patients and controls. A final thing to think about would be that in most of these comparisons that we do, we have to take into account the null condition. Meaning, for example, if we take the Rich Club metric, then we have to take into account that in the randomized situation, in the situation that is not of our interest, if you will, the random case, the null distribution case, there might also be a relationship between hub nodes that we want to benchmark our observation at from our original network of interest, in our case, our brain. So, as actually in most network metrics that we want to examine, studying the null distribution and having a good understanding of what we should include and what we should not include in our null distribution is very important. And also, and that's why I mentioned this, in terms of when we want to examine degree and hubs. So, for example, in the case of the rich club, it is important because also the null distribution would tend to show a certain rich club type of behavior, right? With an increasing level of connectivity between nodes with a higher degree. This is just a normal situation. So that's why we have to benchmark. That's why we have to compute the ratio between our situation of interest and our null distribution, our situation not of interest, our random model. Now for the rich club, this is quite trivial, but as I mentioned before, if we take more complex metrics, closeness centrality, betweenness centrality, participation coefficient, the selection of the null model might become also more complex. And this is definitely something to consider when you are taking your analysis to a more complex level. So to summarize, we have talked about hubs as central points of connectivity in brain networks, and we have talked about different metrics of centrality. We've talked about degree centrality, closeness centrality, betweenness centrality, eigenvector centrality, and we've also discussed several strategies to potentially combine these metrics to identify your hubs. And we've emphasized that it is always, depending on your research questions, which metric you find to be most valuable in selecting hub nodes. There's no one definition in that sense of this is how you should define hubs. We've also seen that we can further categorize hubs according to their role in the network, for example, in terms of connector and provincial hubs, but there might be other types of classifications. And we have also seen that hubs themselves, there might be isolated points, but they can also be actually form other types of units in the network, like a core or a rich club. And we've ended with discussing strategies to compare hubness or hub organization across, for example, patient and control situations. And we have also discussed several caveats and limitations, or actually general things to think about when you are studying hubs, in particular in case control situations. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you have enjoyed this lecture on hub organization, and hopefully we can all see each other again, face-to-face, next year in human brain mapping. Thank you very much for your attention.